Hello and welcome everyone to this event, which is organised by the Lawyers Group of Classics for All and hosted very kindly by Linklaters. This event is being live streamed. We have many members of the Lawyers Group watching us online, and many other supporters of Classics for All also watching online. And it's a great pleasure to see you all here, either in person or virtually. We also have, sitting in the front row, some pupils from Whitefriars School in Harrow, which is one of the many schools supported by Classics for All. They're here with their teacher, Aliki Drakopoulos, from whom you will hear a little later. They are all most welcome, and I'm sure will enjoy this event. Our speaker tonight, Justine McConnell, Dr. Justine McConnell, I should say, is a senior lecturer in comparative literature at King's College, London. Her title is The Odyssey in a Post-Colonial World. Justine is the author of a book called Black Odysseys, the Homeric Odyssey in the African Diaspora since 1939. So she is very much talking to us tonight about a subject in which she is a specialist. My spies at Bloomsbury have already told me about her next book, which is on the stocks, and we may get some foretaste of what will feature in that work. Anyway, I hate chairmen who go on and on introducing the speaker. You're all here to listen to Justine, so Justine.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming today and for tuning in. It's a real pleasure to be here and a pleasure to give a talk for Classics for All, which, as you all know, is doing such invaluable work. So today, what I'd like us to do is think a bit about what would happen to Odysseus and the Odyssey, and what kind of figure Odysseus would be were he to find himself in our modern world. And I'm going to do so by exploring three works in particular by three key 20th century writers, all of whom have engaged with Homer's ancient epic, recasting its themes, its characters, and its ideas, and allowing us to see all of them in a new light. And the three authors are the St Lucian Nobel Prize-winning poet, Derek Walcott, and two African-American writers, so Toni Morrison and Ralph Ellison. But to get started, I thought we would begin by briefly thinking about why the Odyssey has had such resonance through the ages, from antiquity right up until now. So the Odyssey really has had an immense impact on later literature. And in some senses, this might be due to what we could think of as its timeless themes, things that resonated when it was composed that still have a power in our lives. So, for example, we can see it as an epic that is about the search for one's identity and a sense of home. So Odysseus, he's fought in the Trojan War for 10 years, he's trying to get home. But what is home, and what is it for him to return home? Is he the same person who's going to return home, or do we have to accept that your identity is always changing and he has to change, and that the people at home will have changed too? It's also an epic about the triumph of good over evil, right? So hence these kind of timeless themes. We want, most of us want, in the original Homer, we want Odysseus to beat the suitors when he gets home, right? And we want him to beat these monstrous figures that he encounters on his way home. Of course, partly we want him to beat them because he's the one telling us the story about the monstrous figures. So he's pitched it as being this terrific hero and that he is good and they are evil. So we have this kind of sense of it. It's also an epic of the triumph of brain over brawn. So Odysseus is a clever hero rather than primarily being a physically strong one. And if you compare that with your heroes in something like the Iliad, we've got something rather different, right? Achilles there is your warrior. It's all about his kind of strength and his ability at war. in the Iliad, Odysseus is described slightly oddly. He's this bandy-legged figure who's very good at talking. And you kind of think, OK, what's this as the hero? And what we seem to see in this move from the Iliad to the Odyssey is the move from prioritizing this kind of strength to prioritizing your kind of intellectual power. It's also a story about the reuniting of a husband and wife. Will Odysseus get home? Will Penelope have waited? Will they reunite? Will she recognize him? Will she admit she recognizes him? What will happen? So it's a story about that as well. And of course, it's a story of a never-ending journey. So is that fair to say it's a never-ending journey? I think it is. Of course, sorry, plot spoiler, but of course Odysseus gets home. But he gets home rather early, in fact, right? He gets home halfway through the Odyssey. So what's he meant to be doing for the second half? So he lands on Ithaca, beginning of book 13, but we've got to get all the way to book 24. And crucially, all of that time, while he's creating a sense of home, the reuniting with his wife, with his son, with his father, while he's doing that, we also know, because we've already heard, that he's got one more journey to make. So during his travels, he's been predicted that he's going to have to go and appease the gods. And to do this, he needs to travel somewhere so far from the sea that they will mistake his oar for a winnowing fan, a word that I always used to merrily translate without knowing what a winnowing fan was. Do people know what a winnowing fan is? It's a way of kind of sorting your grain. And so people would think that this was a winnowing fan. So he's not home when we think he's home, and he's not even home by the end of the epic. And it's also, of course, a tale of you're battling with monsters. And in some ways, we might think this is very ancient, but almost any sci-fi film you watch now is also about the battle with monsters, and again, linking it with kind of good and evil. And an epic about how you tell a story. So Odysseus is the master storyteller. And this is what we get here. So that's how the stories are so interesting that he tells, because he's casting them, and we keep seeing performing poets in the epic. The other reason why I think the Odyssey's had such kind of resonance and influence is Odysseus's nature. So he's described in the Greek as being polytropos, and people never know how to translate this word, polytropos. The man of many turns, right, would be the sort of most literal. But then what are we talking about? And of course, the Greek leaves it for us to decide. Is it because he travels a lot, or is it because he's tricksy with his mind? So it probably is, of course, alluding to both, right? That's what makes him so polytropos. He goes on so many journeys, but he's also a very, very malleable figure as a character. And that malleable, kind of flexible nature is part of the appeal of Odysseus and the Odyssey for later writers. Even in antiquity, he was represented in very different ways. So for sure, he's the hero of Homer's Odyssey. But by the time we get a little bit later, Sophocles' play, we're then in the 5th century BCE, Sophocles is Philoctetes. Odysseus is pretty close to being the villain of the piece. He's a very unlikable figure there. And just a little bit later, in Euripides' tragedy Hecuba, outright villain, I would say. Obviously not outright. Literature is complex, but as outright as you could get with that. So Odysseus has been this malleable figure for almost as long as the myths have been retold. So what we start seeing, or what we see if we look at modern retellings, is just how he continues to be malleable. As you may know, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty surrounding Homer. So we call the poems Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but it's really a shorthand. We know very little about who Homer was. For example, was he one man or many? We don't know. Maybe this was a term to describe a storyteller, like a bard, or, you know, if we've lost something in our understanding, think of, I don't know, the Wu-Tang Clan. You misunderstand what a clan is, and you think that there was a Mr. Wu-Tang, and this is Homer. So we've decided this. It might have been a group of storytellers. We don't know when he lived. Probably around the 8th century BCE. But the stories he tells are from approximately the 12th century BCE. So, you know, all the bits of kind of, I saw. Well, yes, sort of, once it's gone through many mythic changes and iterations. A lot of us have a notion of him as being blind. Why there are a lot of statues with him as blind? That still doesn't answer the question because it's from the same thing. Well, because one of the storytellers in the Odyssey, Demodocus, is blind. So is that our confusion, or was he blind? And there are even questions about how he composed. Almost certainly. Some people would disagree, but mostly not now. Almost certainly he was composing these stories from a sort of treasure trove of myths, and he was composing them orally, and he was traveling around performing these stories, and they were only written down later. Some people do disagree, but most of us think that this is how it worked. And of course, we don't even know whether he was a he. There's this great book by Samuel Butler from 1897 called The Authoress of the Odyssey, where he reckons that the poet, I think it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but he reckons that the poet has put themselves into the Odyssey in the figure of Nausicaa. And so she's telling this story, and he writes this whole thing. So, uncertainty over Homer. 1 minute plot summary. Often people do know the Odyssey, but we know it in different ways, and there's nothing worse than not being quite sure of where the narrative's going. So the Odyssey, of course, tells the story of Odysseus' journey home after spending 10 years at Troy fighting. And on the way, that's when he meets those fantastical creatures that for many of us are the ones we encounter first, often in children's versions of the Odyssey. So that's when you get the Cyclops, and you get Scylla and Charybdis, and Circe and Calypso. And all that time, what we really know is that he's striving to return home. Sometimes he doesn't seem to be striving so very, very hard. So he spends a very happy year with the witch Circe. No complaints, has to be reminded by his men that he's meant to be hurrying on his way home. He spends 7 years with the beautiful nymph Calypso. Now, we do hear that he spends all day weeping on the beach. Poor Odysseus, he wants to get back to Penelope, and all night making love with the beautiful nymph Calypso. So we are possibly in some doubt about how hard he's striving there, or how sympathetic we should be to him. Eventually, as I say, he does make it home, but it's halfway through the epic. And what that tells us and reminds us is that the second half is really going to be dedicated to him reasserting his place. So reasserting his place in Ithaca, king of Ithaca, husband to Penelope, father to Telemachus, son to Laertes. And the epic must be just as interested in that as it is in the journeys that we think about. We get half the epic dedicated to this. So the idea of home is much less about a geographical place than about one's identity and one's relationships with others. That seems to be what home really is. And Odysseus is only really home once that identity is back in place. And if he goes off once more, you might question what's going to happen to his identity then, like Alfred Lord Tennyson did. That's the whole idea of his Ulysses poem. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world and setting well in order. All of this is Odysseus has got home and he's bored. And he goes away again because he wants to go off on another adventure. So that's, Tennyson thought that might be happening. So that's the kind of Odyssey and its kind of influence and resonances through the ages. But why this post-colonial world? And why would we have Greco-Roman antiquity in post-colonial literature? The most fundamental answer is because the colonial powers under European empires themselves made use of classics. So when European colonizers invaded and oppressed regions of the world, they imposed their language, their religion, and very often the study of ancient Greece and Rome on the peoples in those places. Why Greece and Rome in particular? Partly because all over Europe it was being held up as the kind of pinnacle of learning and culture. Greece and Rome is what we look to, it's what we trace our histories to, they said. And also because Greco-Roman literature had sort of, one of the reasons it had more weight in this kind of dialogue than other canonical literatures is because it could be shared across Europe, because it's united with two languages, ancient Greek and Latin, albeit dead languages, but you don't have to know all the modern European languages. So that's why we see it so prominently in sort of post-colonial education, or hopefully colonial education, and less so in the post-colonial. So That's one aspect of how classics came into the education system of, for example, the writers that I'm going to say a bit about today. One might ask then why some writers of the African diaspora engage with a tool that's previously been used as a tool of oppression. I would say that this is in part because it's quite a powerful maneuver to take something that has been used to oppress you and not only make it your own, but cast it in a new light. Show the people who have used this as an oppressive tool what they missed, what they didn't see in this text. In doing so, these writers also show that they have an absolutely equal claim to this literature and this history. And working with this literature is not only about resisting oppression, it's also a very fundamental position. Why would postcolonial writers not engage with Greco-Roman antiquity, just as they engage with literature and ideas from a wide range of times and places? So towards the end of this talk, we'll see that Ralph Ellison makes that very argument explicitly, and all three of the writers make it implicitly throughout their work, as I will hopefully show. So to get started, though, let's have a bit of a think about the kind of how and the why of these authors turning to classics and to Homer. And I'd like us to have a look a bit closer at the image that was used on the slide there. So Romare Bearden's Home to Ithaca. I don't know if people are already familiar with Bearden's series of collages, but he did this series in 1977, a whole series going through most of the episodes of the Odyssey. And Romare Bearden was a 20th century African-American artist. And this one, Home to Ithaca, depicts that moment that Odysseus finally returns to his homeland of Ithaca. Or does it? As critic Robert O'Malley has pointed out, this image here has no correspondence in Homer. If you remember the details, Odysseus gets landed on Ithaca asleep, it's shrouded in mist. He is certainly not standing there on the prow of his ship, boldly returning home. So what has Bearden done here? Well, he's rewritten Odysseus's return home. He's got him wholeheartedly as a returning hero, as you can kind of see from that stance at the front of the ship. And this, I think, is Bearden's sort of response to what was a very pressing concern among African-American communities in the 1970s that asked where one could look for an African-American hero in art and literature. Not because they weren't there, they were, but because societal prejudices had really marginalized a lot of work by African-American writers and African-American artists. And here Bearden gives us an African-American hero in the figure of this Odysseus returning. And throughout Bearden's collages, all the figures depicted are, as you can see from this one, all the figures depicted are black, both reflecting, as he said himself, on African-American life, but also, as might be coming to mind, making you think of those black figure vase paintings from antiquity, where, of course, the figures on the red vase are painted black, nothing to do with anything about race. But so we have the two together that come here. You might be thinking of the vases, you might be thinking about the more direct African-American context. And Bearden asks us to keep both in mind all the time. So I don't know if anyone has read Derek Walcott's Omeros. If you haven't, I would encourage you to. Walcott was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature 2 years after Omeros was published. And although a Nobel Prize is never awarded for a single work, the poem was widely seen as the final spur that was needed for him to win the prize. He'd been hoping to win it for a while. And the poem itself is set in his sort of hometown, really, in a fishing village called Gros Islet on St Lucia. It's on the northwest coast of the island. And it tells of the lives of fishermen called Achille, Hector, and Philoctete. If their classical names sound surprising, they are, in fact, not uncommon in the Caribbean, because historically, enslavers would rename the enslaved people, and they often chose Greco-Roman names and sometimes biblical names in an effort to kind of show off their learning, and also probably to mock the enslaved people, giving these names and imposing these names on them. And the history of St Lucia is that it was sort of violently fought over by the British and the French. So it kept being passed back and forth in this period. And that being passed back and forth meant it came to be known as Helen of the West Indies, like Helen being passed back and forth between the Greeks and the Trojans. And the French angle is that although St Lucia is an Anglophone island, you can see the French traces in Achille rather than Achilles, Philoctete instead of Philoctetes. And actually the St Lucian Creole is a French-derived Creole, whereas the sort of official language is English. So we've got Hector, Achille, and Philoctete. They're fishermen. We're wondering where the kind of Homeric bits are, whether it's beyond the names. We also have a Helen here, over whom Hector and Achille fight, which might, if you're already trying to map onto Homer, be getting a bit thrown by the sort of wrong people fighting over these figures. A reminder that if you think you're going to just find Homer here, you're not. That's not what he wants to do with this. And we also have other inhabitants of Gros Islet. So there's the lady who owns the bar, Ma Kilman, and the No Pain Cafe. There's a retired expat couple, Dennis and Maud Plunkett. And there's a sort of shape-shifting oral storyteller, Seven Seas and Omeros, and we also have the poem's narrator, who seems to be very closely mapped on to Walcott himself. He fits some of these elements in there. The title there is a transliteration of the modern Greek name for Homer. But Walcott denied that this poem, and I mean, you can see the title page there, or the cover there, but it's a 300-page poem. Nonetheless, Walcott says it wasn't an epic. So here we've got the bit here where Walcott protests against people, and particularly classicists, saying, this is an epic poem, much like Homer. So Walcott said, I do not think of it as an epic, certainly not in the sense of epic design. Where are the battles? There are a few, I suppose, but epic makes people think of great wars and warriors. That isn't the Homer I was thinking of. I was thinking of Homer, the poet of the seven seas. So why does Walcott deny that his poem is an epic? I think there are a number of things going on here. Firstly, it's only a partial denial, isn't it? We've got that qualification, not in the sense of epic design, and that isn't the Homer I was thinking of, indicate that it may be epic, but not the kind of epic that we might be imagining. We might think again of Romain Bearden altering the way Odysseus returns home, so not asleep as in Homer, but you're kind of heroically steering the ship. We've got something, but he's going to make a change to it. Another reason to deny his poem is epic is the very close link between epic and empire. So that's not only happened by epics that retell the founding of empires, possibly most famously, and certainly for classicists, Virgil's Aeneid, that really is an epic about founding the Roman Empire, but also because, as we've heard, when European empires colonized other lands, they often imposed their education system, as well as their language and culture. And Greco-Roman antiquity was a part of that. So the link between epic and empire is very well established. And I think the other thing that's going on here is that Walcott is reminding us, asking us, not to just read his poem as an adaptation. For all that we might know that adaptations aren't less than the original, we do tend to talk of it in those terms, as if somehow you dilute something by adapting it. And Walcott says, no, here's my poem, you need to read it on my terms, don't read it through Homer. Don't read it through Homer, he says, and then he gives us Achille, Hector, Philoctete, Helen, etc. So kind of playing with us there in some ways. And Achille is indeed, in a number of ways, an epic hero. His narrative can also be seen as a journey home, even though in this poem he scarcely leaves St Lucia. Now, this again is focusing on the sense that home is about one's identity as well as a physical place. Achille's journey is one in which he tries to find out where home is for him. So Is home Africa, given that his ancestors were enslaved and transported from Africa to the Caribbean? Is home St Lucia itself? The poem depicts Achilles' journey and his kind of way through this issue by an imagined journey that he makes back to Africa, so to speak. So he's a fisherman, he's making his living that way, and he catches the sun, he catches too much sun while he's out fishing one day, and with sunstroke, he hallucinates that he walks back along the bed of the Atlantic, reversing the direction of the Middle Passage by which enslaved people were brought from Africa to the Caribbean. And he arrives in an unspecified part of Africa within the poem, and there he meets his ancestors who don't recognize him, reminding us of this break that was enforced by slavery. And he joins their community, and then tragically he witnesses a slave raid. And he tries to stop the raid, but, and occasionally Walcott can't help himself, he's felled by his proverbial Achilles' heel. This time he doesn't get an arrow in the heel, but he gets his foot caught up in a vine, and that gets caught around his heel, and so he is unable to stop this. And this hallucination is very much cast as a journey through the underworld, somewhat like Odysseus goes through, because he's meeting his past ancestors again. He's meeting the people who are clearly now dead. And he's learning from that journey and learning how to go forward and learning how to find his own sense of home. And I think this journey helps to, well, it does help to reinforce Achilles' pride in his African roots. When he comes back to St Lucia, he wants to celebrate those, but also his absolute certainty that it is the Caribbean, that it's St Lucia, not Africa, that is his home. And that is partly Walcott's response to Afrocentric movements that were popular at the time. So what Walcott said is, we must look inside, the West Indies exists, but we must find it. So rather than tracing all one's roots back to Africa, let's look into the Caribbean. And that's what we see in Achilles. He goes through a process of the same kind of journey that you might see in Odysseus, who's trying to work out how you return from the Trojan War and how you become a hero in this new world, how you be a hero in peacetime when you're not needed to fight. Now, towards the end of the poem, Walcott reflects on the way that his story repeats with difference the one that we find in Homer's epic. So we get this, well, you can see it's on page 320. So we really are near the end of the poem there. So he says, or he writes, I sang of quiet Achilles, Aphalabe's son, who never descended in an elevator, who had no passport since the horizon needs none, never begged nor borrowed, was nobody's waiter, whose end, when it comes, will be a death by water, which is not for this book, which will remain unknown and unread by him. I sang the only slaughter that brought him delight, and that from necessity, of fish, sang the channels of his back in the sun. Now, what Walcott does there is invert a number of very characteristic moments in Homer. So instead of attributing his inspiration to a muse, as Homer does, he simply says, I sang. It's great, takes all the credit for himself. Never mind the muse, I sang of this. And the Iliad begins with the anger of Achilles. But here, this poem ends with quiet Achilles. It's not your same Achilles. Something has changed. We need to see him in a new way. And rather than the famed warrior Achilles, for this Achilles, for Walcott's Achilles, the only pleasure that he takes, the only killing that he takes pleasure in is the killing of fish, which is how he makes his living. And on it goes, these intricate little inversions of, kind of riffs on the Homeric epic that ask us to see both the ancient and the modern poems in new lights, to not map everything directly onto it, and to look for the differences as much as the similarities. And this kind of idea is a notion of a kind of repeating with difference was the phrase I used earlier. It's from a scholar, Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is the host of the American version of Who Do You Think You Are on TV, of their finding your roots. And he has also written a lot on African-American literature, and what he says is that people repeat with difference. You take from something and you make a change that brings in other elements, might bring in more oral elements as well, and makes us look again at those texts. And I think this is very much what Walcott is doing. The answers aren't all in Homer. And if you read Homer again after reading Walcott, it looks different, which is kind of, and vice versa, of course. So if we take a step back then, so this was from 1990, if we take a step back about 20 years to Toni Morrison, and in particular to her novel Sula, which is a less well-known one, I think, generally. So Toni Morrison minored in classics at university, at Howard University, which is a historically black college in the States. And she weaves aspects of classical myth throughout many of her works, perhaps most famously in her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Beloved, where she reimagines the true story of Margaret Garner, who was an enslaved woman who was nicknamed, particularly in the press, the modern Medea in the 19th century. After she killed one of her children. She killed the child to stop them being taken into slavery because she knew that the slavery was worse than death. But the press named her as the modern Medea, which obviously makes us rethink Medea as well, and how you might read that. Now, Sula is not an explicit retelling of the Odyssey, and to perceive it as such would be to do it an injustice, because that's only one thread of the story, but it is one of the threads. And there are some direct references to Greek myth. So we have a character named Ajax in this story. And on the novel goes, and finally Sula realizes that Ajax, and she's always spelt it like the Greek hero, and we've been reading it like that, she finds his driving license, his, I can't remember, identity card, Albert Jax, Ajax. All this time I thought he was Ajax, is what she kind of says. And we realize that Toni Morrison is messing with us. If we thought that we understood who Ajax was, we've been as mistaken as Sula was. So asking us not to feel too self-satisfied, I think, if we know the classical references. And Sula's story, fascinatingly, like Odysseus's, is one of leaving home and eventually returning again. But what Morrison gives us is what an ancient epic never did, which is a female questing hero, one who gets to journey. If we want to think of Penelope as a hero, but she only gets to stay put. You know, she doesn't actually get to go anywhere. So here we get the female questing hero. And in post-civil rights America, Morrison depicts not only a female questing hero, but a black female questing hero. And where in Homer's Odyssey, we can never be sure what Penelope is thinking because she's so seldom given voice, Morrison not only gives voice to this central female figure, but makes her the hero. Even the title announces it. This is about Sula, you know, and this is about the woman. And in doing so, Morrison gives at least one version of voice to a black woman hero, women who have been doubly silenced by both racism and sexism. So we have something new with this figure. And famously, in Homer's Odyssey, Penelope weaves her tapestry by day, and she unpicks it at night. So she's trying to put off the day when she's going to have to marry the suitors, because she said that, you know, when she finishes weaving this shroud for her father-in-law Laertes, she will marry one of the suitors. So she unpicks it at night to put off that day. And that's a story that, you know, we're very familiar with. But there's a critic, Carolyn Harburn, who has suggested another way of reading Penelope's weaving, and it's one that I find really appealing. So she says that Penelope weaves and unweaves her story because she has no model to follow. She's not sure what story she's weaving into the tapestry. So she weaves, not that one, unpicks it and tries again. Why is she so uncertain? Well, there had been no female-centered narratives in which women could act rather than merely react to things. So she weaves and she tries out one story and she unpicks it to try out another story. And the Greek word for a poet and storyteller is a rhapsode, and that does come from the Greek to stitch. So the idea of stitching a story is already there within the Greek. And with Sula, what I would say Morrison has done is give us one version of the story that a Penelope might want to weave. So Sula leaves home and she returns 10 years later. So Odysseus takes 20 years, but 10 years are at Troy, so the journey is the same length of time. Sula sleeps with men and she leaves them again in a way that would go absolutely unremarked if done by men in the novel. But Sula is judged by different standards and she's rather cast out for doing this. And rather than returning for a wife or a husband, if we were to follow the Homeric model, Morrison's novel prioritizes the bond of friendship. So it's really a novel about the friendship between Sula and her friend Nell, and the absolute compatibility between these two. So in Homer, we hear that Odysseus and Penelope think in the same way. They are homophrosynaire. They are just on the same wavelength, if that's not too colloquial for this kind of idea. And that's what Sula and Nell are. So this is about friendship and thinking in a new way about this. And if we've missed the fact that this is an Odyssean rewriting that Morrison is engaged in here, she does then flag it to us, or I would read this as her flagging it to us, because Sula returns home and she says this to her grandmother: "Don't you say hello to nobody when you ain't seen them for 10 years?" And of course, Odysseus's probably most famous episode is with the Cyclops. And what does he do? He tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody. And so when the Cyclops is screaming out for help and all the other Cyclopes come running to help him, and they say, "What's the matter?" And he says, "Nobody is hurting me." And they say, "Well, shut up then and be quiet and we'll go back to sleep," right? So this kind of glimpse of the negatives that could fit. But what we've done is that we've got Odysseus's most famous moment in Sula's returning moment there, and reinforced by the fact that she too has been away for 10 years and that we get all these sort of portents as she comes in. So Morrison gives us a female questing hero who returns home on her own terms and does it in a different way. If we were to take one final step back in time now to 1952 and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, we'll see yet another take on the idea of the hero returning home. So Ellison's novel has become a fixture in the American literary canon. It's really widely taught at schools and universities in the US, but I think still not here usually. And it was published 2 years before the Supreme Court ruling against segregation, against racial segregation in education. So it's very much pre the civil rights movement. And unlike the muddle that people often hear, there's no definite article, it's not sci-fi, it's not a sort of H.G. Wells thing, which the protagonist himself says right at the start. He explains that he is invisible, as he says, simply because people refuse to see me. He's invisible because he's an African-American man in pre-civil rights America, and society is trying to pretend that he doesn't exist. They literally look through him. And the novel opens with this moment where he bumps into somebody and he's about to be raging because they've just smashed straight into him in the street. They don't seem to see him. And he realizes this man sort of literally doesn't see him. He can't quite conceive within his worldview of having, African-American people as equals within the society. And the novel is perhaps a journey to try and get some of the visibility. Invisible Man remains unnamed throughout. So therefore, we've kind of got him signifying both on invisibility, and of course, he then is occupying that same position of nobody in the Cyclops' cave, except he's stuck. He never gets his name. He never gets it back. He never has it before. We never know the name of our protagonist, who is our narrator in this novel. And what we do see is that if he wants to get his name, if he wants to move out of that kind of position, he's going to have to seek out his own path. And so again, a bit like we saw in Sula, where you have to learn to create a new story and create a new path, Invisible Man is going to have to do the same. And the novel is narrated by Invisible Man. There's not really another way of referring to him, so we will just call him Invisible Man. And he narrates it from a home that he's made for himself under the streets of Harlem. And he's managed to tap into the electricity board, and he's lit up this place, but he's literally underground. So again, if you think of the sort of underworld moment, where is he? Is he in a deathly moment? That doesn't seem to quite be, but he calls it a hibernation. He's not really the hero that we're expecting to be at that moment. He has not yet returned home. And even by the end of the novel begins and ends. It's, you know, sort of couched with a prologue and an epilogue, really, of Invisible Man telling us, I'm nearly ready. I'm about to come out. I'm nearly ready to come out of my hole underground. And in between, he tells us really a Bildungsroman, a whole journey of his kind of growing up here. But at the end, we don't know. People are very undecided, you know, and you know, anyone, when they've read it, the question is always, do you think he emerges from there, or is he just staying there? Now, the fact that he's narrating his own story obviously is quite an empowering moment, but he does seem to be stuck in this underworld and still summoning the strength, and such an interrupted journey. You might say, well, what's going on there? One's tempted to note that it reflects the almost insurmountable obstacles that were in the way of African-American people prior to the civil rights movement. How is he going to get his identity? And it's not a coincidence that his journey is interrupted, really. So Ellison asks us to think about whether it's possible to return home, to have an independent identity as an African-American man in the 1950s. Or in the 1950s in the United States. So it's worth noting that, as well as some very explicit Odyssean moments, which Ellison does put in there, so there's a moment where this sort of antagonist, who we've known throughout as Brother Jack, and who's sort of a leader of something that looks very close to the Communist Party, though Ellison sort of said, oh, purely coincidental, he said at the time, which it isn't quite. They're having an argument, and we don't know this is about to happen either, because we haven't known that this guy has a glass eye, but his glass eye pops out into a glass, and he squints at Invisible Man with cyclopean irritation. And you know, having sort of resisted explicitly saying it, we then have Ellison saying, here it is, in case you missed it, in case you missed all the little breadcrumbs I've laid for you, here is a moment. And Ellison often spoke of the appeal of Greco-Roman antiquity for him. So you can see here on the slide that he discusses the similarities and the differences between ancient Greek and African-American myths. So he's using here terms that were common then and weren't offensive either at the time. So he refers to Negro-American, where we might say African-American now. And he's obviously using the Roman name for Odysseus, Ulysses. And he says, I knew the trickster Ulysses just as early as I knew the wily rabbit of Negro-American lore. And I could easily imagine myself a pint-sized Ulysses, but hardly a rabbit, no matter how human and resourceful or Negro. My point is that the Negro-American writer is also an heir of the human experience, which is literature, and this might well be more important to him than his living folk tradition. And the title that you can see there, Change the Joke and Slip the Yoke, it seems to me very much what all of these writers are doing. You take something that is oppressive, that is a yoke, and you make a change, and it no longer is. You've now kind of made it a freeing thing and something that allows you to do something else. So again, this kind of the riffing on something, repeating it with difference. And that final idea here of an heir of the human experience, which is literature, that final idea that literature doesn't belong to any one group of people is key. Classics is no more the inheritance of people in Europe than of anywhere else. It's an illogical move to think that you have more connection because, you know, something that happened, you know, over 2,000 years ago is more connected to Europe somehow. And I think perhaps that's the best place to kind of wrap up, because what each of these writers shows us is that the literature of ancient Greece and Rome is endlessly malleable. it can be shaped and reshaped to have new meanings and new resonances in different times and different places. And by its very nature, it's always open and accessible. And if sometimes, as a result of class or gender or racial prejudice, that accessibility has been limited, then Morrison and Walcott and Ellison, as well as the invaluable work of Classics for All, remind us why it's so important that we keep ensuring that it is available to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Justine. The Iliad and the Odyssey are, of course, living works which reappear in the literature of every age. James Joyce's Ulysses being a classic example. But you brought to life tonight just how vividly it reappears in Caribbean literature, which I'm afraid had totally passed me by until now. Justine has kindly agreed to answer some questions. I'm sure you're all bursting with them. Who has the first question? Yes, I can't see against the light, but do. Oh, Nicholas, yes.
I get the point that Walcott didn't want to be. Sorry, I get the point that Walcott didn't want to be an epic in the sense of lots of battles and all. But what's the reference to the seven seas as opposed to his fishing sea around St Lucia?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think he's doing a couple of things there. So in a very pathetic moment, he actually makes a joke about the vitamin pills and the seven seas, but I think this isn't his key bit. So he says that the character named Seven Seas is named after these. But also going much further back in antiquity, even beyond the Greeks, we have the idea of the seven seas to mean all the seas. And so there we have perhaps a global Homer, a global storyteller, that is disconnected, well, not disconnected from Greece, is bigger than that Homer. And I think his idea that these kind of storytellers who can tell the really powerful stories have always been in many different places. And so there was a colloquial notion of the seven seas to encompass the whole world, really. I think that's what he wants to perhaps get away in some senses also from the sort of too nationalistic element that can often go with epic.
So the point is everywhere rather than seas.
So both. So partly everywhere, and then he has a lovely moment where he's sat, where the narrator is sat on the steps at Trafalgar Square of St Martin's in the Field, and he's chatting with Omeros, and he says, "Oh, well, I never read the Odyssey, not all the way through." And he's kind of slightly embarrassed because he's talking to the guy who composed this. And he then says, "Oh, but I've always heard your voice in that sea." So the idea of, I think, the uncontainability of a sea and the uncontainability of orality that can always change rather than the written word that tends to fix it. So yeah, both aspects going on, I think.
Thank you. Yes, who's next? Yes, certainly, the lady there.
So you focused a lot on the Odyssey, and I think a lot of that is quite obvious because the Odyssey is a fiction-based book. I wonder if you've done any work on the Iliad and whether that appears in the same way, or whether because it's so much more about battles, it's just not as easy to adapt.
So I think, thank you. Yeah, no, I think there are quite a few adaptations of the Iliad, but fewer. I think, even if it's a bit broad brushstroke, the Odyssey seems to have a particular power, also because it's got all of it, right? Because we do have battles, so we get to, despite what Walcott then says with his, so we kind of get all the elements in together. In terms of sort of post-colonial ones, much less so. What we're seeing, there have been some modern, recent rewritings. Very often what they've been doing with these, there have been a few, Pat Barker and Madeline Miller, giving voice to the women whose voices we don't hear. And that, I think, is the main way that people have thought of it in the 20th and 21st century. But it does seem to... sorry, that's slightly untrue. Alice Oswald's Memorial is a terrific one that really thinks about grief and memorialization and all the tragedy of the battles. And that's a very interesting poem, and that is very much from the Iliad, and it's a very slim poem, so you sort of gone the other way. But I think there is an argument to be made for that the Odyssey has so many different elements that it means that people can take a little bit from it and they can do anything, either the monsters or the battles or the journey home. Yeah, thanks.
I agree with what you say about Pat Barker. Can I ask a question? You described how classical literature was imposed upon the enslaved peoples. One of the problems with classical literature is that slavery is accepted as a fact of life in all Greco-Roman literature. I mean, some people said you should treat slaves well, but there was no suggestion by anybody that slavery should be abolished. And did the African peoples who were brought here or descended from them resent the fact that they had imposed upon them a literature where slavery was part of the natural order?
Yeah, I think it causes a big problem for many of these writers, but also makes it particularly fascinating. So Walcott often spoke about being very torn between languages, between cultures. He said, you know, am I really supposed to choose between the Caribbean and this massive kind of European canonical inheritance that he had from his education system and all the problems that go with that? And I'm sure there would have been, we don't have many records to find the resentment of the renaming, but we don't have the records for the very reason that enslaved people were renamed and weren't writing. That's obviously quite a that's obviously a very aggressive and a kind of oppressive move. But I think in some ways that's part of this appeal, is to remind us so that it's quite hard to read these ancient texts without thinking of slavery. And then when you read it, something that's thinking of a more modern slavery, you kind of are confronted with that ideological system and wondering how much it's played into why we're prioritising them as well.
Thank you. We have time for one more speaker before, one more question before we hear the next speaker. Yes, Mohan.
Oh, I got the mic first, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry, whoever was
sorry,
first.
it's Tom.
Tom, yes, Tom, of course you must go first.
It was the same topic as you raised, which I wanted to raise too, but more specifically, the most attractive and fascinating character in the Odyssey, Euryclea, is herself a slave, isn't she, enslaved by Odysseus' forebears. Do any of these writers pick up her character? Do they mirror that anywhere?
Yeah, so in a different work of Walcott's, in his Odyssey that he did for the RSC, Euryclea has quite a lot of prominence, and she has this great line that plays in with a lot of arguments at the time, where she says it's Egypt that cradled Greece until Greece matures. And that plays very much into the idea that Greece never was this white and rather European kind of place. It's the argument that there was a lot more interaction around the Mediterranean. And so the fact that Euryclea is stating that, and she has a very prominent position as sort of even more clearly the one who brought up Odysseus and then Telemachus, in that I think he chose to make more of her there so that he could think about those kind of ideas. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for a second last question. Mohan.
Thank you very much. You were talking a bit about how we've rediscovered the role of Odysseus in postcolonial literature. Sorry. We were talking about how we've rediscovered the role of Odysseus and how that's been brought up in postcolonial literature. And I'm mindful of there are many works these days that focus a lot more on Penelope, like Carol Ann Duffy, The World's Wife, or Margaret Atwood. Has Penelope's time come? I mean, are there any postcolonial works which focus on Penelope sort of first and foremost? You discussed a bit in Sula. We have the female questing hero, but it feels to me that's a sort of female Odysseus. I'll be interested in if anybody's looked at Penelope and how she tells her story.
Yeah, that is interesting. And as I'm kind of trying to think through the ones, I mean, there are now a number of feminist rewritings, but I'm not, and of course something will come to me straight after this, but at the moment I'm not thinking of ones that are intersectionally interested in kind of thinking of Penelope and making, as you say, I mean, Sula is very much an Odysseus figure. Not that is instantly coming to mind, although now I feel that I will have to search them out and find out. There may well be. They may be on the horizon.
Thank you very much. We are now going to hear a few words from a lady who does come from Ithaca. Aliki Drakopoulos is the head of classics at Whitefriars School in Harrow. As I said, that is one of the schools which Classics for All supports, and she's going to tell us a little bit about, she and perhaps her pupils as well are going to tell us a little bit about what they're up to and what Classics for All does.
Right.
Aliki.
Thank you so much. We are really excited to be here, and thank you so much for having us. We just wanted to explain a little bit about our school. And what it's about, how we started classics at our school. I've brought along some of my students, so we've got A-level students and GCSE students here studying classical civilization, so we're really excited to talk to you. So our school is called Whitefriars School. We are a brand new school in Harrow, Harrow Wealdstone to be precise. This is what our school looks like from above. So we're just going to give you a few facts so you can understand kind of where we are. So we're in the borough of Harrow, and Wealdstone, where we've circled right there, is where our school is. A bit of background about Wealdstone: we are in a quite deprived area, so a lot of it's very kind of cultural, a lot of mixed cultures, which is amazing. So it was quite interesting to bring in classics, and the whole like Roman Greco world is really interesting to some of our pupils. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So we are a state comprehensive school. We're an academy. We are a mixed school, so I know we've just got girls here today, but we are a mixed school, boys and girls. We're also an all-through school, so that means that we start off at nursery and go all the way up to sixth form. Because we're a new school and we started in July 2016, the current year 12s are actually our first sixth formers, so we haven't got year 13 yet. That will be next year. So we're kind of getting there, so our school is developing and growing as we speak. We have approximately 1,457 students, and that's including primary, all the way up to sixth form secondary. So quite a few students, and 74% of our students are EAL, which means they're English as an additional language. So English is not their first language. So that's quite a high percentage. And approximately 29% of our students are eligible for FSM, which means free school meals. So that just kind of puts things into perspective of our area and our students. But we have been rated outstanding by Ofsted, which is brilliant. So we do quite a lot of work to support our students in our community and our area. So we came here to talk to you about why classics and how we started classics at Whitefriars School. My background is, well, as you said, I'm from Ithaca myself, so Odysseus is very close to home. And I've grown up being involved in this ancient Greek world, and I was really interested in it, the mythology side of it, but also the history. And then I thought to myself, well, actually, a lot of students do like mythology, and the more I talked to our students, they have their own mythologies from their own countries, and just it was kind of fascinating to have a conversation about it. So we started off doing a Greek mythology club when I first started the school. So I teach French and Spanish, I should have said that. I teach French and Spanish, I'm a linguist with an interest in the classical world. So I started off with a Greek mythology club, and I saw that a lot of our kids really loved it. Then it became kind of Norse mythology club, and it became all these different mythologies, and I thought there's something here for our kids. And then as a linguist, I'm kind of a big fan of etymology. As a Greek as well, I would like if I said that a lot of when a Greek word comes out, I'm like, oh, that's Greek. It's there. So when I started looking at how to develop our students' vocabulary, when you put a story to a word, they tend to remember it more. So then things started linking. I then researched Latin and classics and whether it was a thing. I didn't have the opportunity to do it when I was at school. And it was. So we reached out to Classics for All, but we'll talk about the support that they've given us in a minute. So how and when we started. So we started planning in February 2020. So we all know that was just pre-pandemic. But that actually helped me because it gave me more time to research how I can really plan this out for our students. So the first lockdown for me was actually great. I got to plan. But we started our first course in September 2020, and we started off with year 7, 8 and 9, Key Stage 3 kind of Latin and classics, 1 lesson a week, unfortunately, but also a good way to start. And then last year, kind of put out the call to see if anyone was interested in GCSE classical civilization and A-level classics. And they were. And they'll tell you a little bit about it in a minute. And you can see that we've got quite high numbers. So every student in year 7, 8 and 9 is doing key stage, well, Latin and classics. We have our first year 10 class this year. Also bringing up some students next year, 20 students. Next year will be 24 students in classics for year 11. And we've got our year 12s here. So it's pretty great. And going on to year 13 as well. Classics for All has been amazing. They have really supported us the whole way. And when we reached out in April 2020, they have been alongside us the whole time. So they've given me support, they've supported me with Latin training. Stephen Hunt came, some of you might know Stephen Hunt, he's brilliant, and he came to our school and supported myself and the other MFL teachers to teach Latin. The good thing is, as linguists, we understood of how to teach language, so it wasn't super difficult, but it's also really fun to learn a new skill. And Caroline Bristow came to our school and supported us with GCSE training and A-level training. So they've been absolutely phenomenal. They've provided us with bursaries for all resources in all key stages, and they have actually given us a bursary to take our students to the Roman Baths next year on a trip. So it's just fantastic, and we're all super excited. And the impact of our school with this is that, well, as I said before, they love learning mythology. So they're linking it to their own cultures and their own kind of history. So our discussions do get quite animated, but in a good way. We've also taken a school approach now on building literacy across the curriculum. So as I said, story of the word, we're building etymology in all the subjects, which is amazing. And we've also been able to embed a lot of classical things into other subject areas, so it's a very cross-curricular based subject for our school. And our new house system is based on the ancient cities. And actually, I've put the logos there because we're super proud to say that one of our sixth formers designed the logos himself. So we're building our school as we speak, like I said. It's pretty amazing. And I thought it'd be great for our students to give you a bit of what they think of classics and what they enjoy learning the most as well. So we've got Alexia, Anna Maria, Stefania, Renali and Delia here with us.
So the reason, why I started learning classics and how I actually got this interest was when I started doing a GCSE at history in year 10 and year 11. And Miss Drake actually came about with the subject classical civilization. And I was actually interested because I really liked studying history, especially ancient history. So while we were learning the different topics, we also got to realize how the ancient Greek civilization actually built our civilization right now, and how a lot of the things have changed throughout the years. But the main topic that I really enjoy in classics is actually the Greco-Persian Wars, because it also shows a very distinct side of the Persians and of the Greeks, and it also makes us realize that if the Greeks have won actually the battles between the Greeks, our world would have been extremely different, and we would have probably had different languages, different cultures, different beliefs, as well as different religions, and everything would have been really changed. So that was really what I really liked.
So for me, classics has always been one of those subjects where you never quite get objective information. There's never concrete, so it's always up to interpretation. And you're able to draw your own conclusion and your own ideologies from different aspects of classics. For example, the Homeric question, that debate has been very prominent in the classical world. And I feel that with the small dichotomies that you can see in the Odyssey and the Iliad, you can make your own interpretation as to whether Homer did compose these poems by himself or had help from other people. And I feel that that was what sparked my interest into classical literature. Not only that, but another play that sparked my interest in classical literature is Euripides' Medea. This is because you really get to understand concepts of morality and law, and many philosophers like Euripides, you really see how in the ancient world, law and knowledge was something that was very important when judging someone. He defends Medea, and because she lacks knowledge. She lacks the knowledge of how it would feel to murder her sons. She lacks that concept of consequence, in a way. And even in our world today, like Alexia was saying, it's been shaped by classical origins. So I feel like we have the responsibility to learn about our own origins and how our own society has been built on concepts from the ancient world.
Having done classics at GCSEs, we started with the mythical and religion side of it, and it built a foundation of actually understanding classics and how it shaped our modern world. I think it's really important to see how far we've come as in terms of like society because of the ancient civilizations, and how far my favourite part of actual classics that we've done this year was the Amazonites, because you see the women's side of the thing, which is not very spoken or shown in, should I say, some parts of classics. And I think it's so important to see how far women have come because they've been suppressed throughout history, and how they continue to fight and make a name for themselves, which allows us to just carry on and keep fighting for equality. And I think doing classics as well as GCSEs has helped with not only classics but history, and it branches out to like science and mathematics, and it's just so cool to see how far it actually is embedded into the curriculum as a whole.
Learning classics has sparked a genuine interest of mine into the architecture of the ancient world, which has then also influenced my GCSE artwork, which I am quite proud of and I would like to take further.
And the last slide for us is, from me actually, is what comes next. So we haven't stopped here. We're still developing not just our school, as I said, but our Latin and classics curriculum. So we plan on introducing Latin at GCSE next year or the year after. We're going to try and get 2 lessons a week of Latin at classics at GCSE. That is the aim. And I'm really excited to say that our department is growing. So it's becoming an actual department in our school. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to us.
Alekian students, thank you very much for that excellent presentation or set of presentations. I renew my thanks to Justine for her excellent talk tonight. I thank all of you for coming and the very much larger number of people who are watching online. Those of you who are lawyers and haven't yet joined the Lawyers Group of Classics for All, I very much hope that you will do so that you can come to lots more events like that. And those of you who are not lawyers but are doing something far more interesting, I hope that you will, if you're not already, become supporters of Classics for All and support the valuable work which Classics for All does, as illustrated so graphically just now by Aliki Drakopoulos and her students. The next event which we shall hold is our annual mock trial in the Supreme Court. This year, Alexander the Great will be standing trial for war crimes. I hope that a very large audience, both remote and in person, will attend that event. But that concludes the proceedings this evening. I thank you all for your participation.